At Midwest Distribution Center, Nathan Riley was just another face in a blue uniform, working double shifts to keep a roof over his daughter's head. For 10 years, he followed every rule, never stepped out of line, until today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When a distinguished stranger lay injured in the rain, Nate's supervisor made it clear, stay at your station or lose everything. But as a single father, Nate knew what it meant to be alone and hurting. His choice that day cost him the only job he had. What he didn't know, as he clutched his termination papers in trembling hands, was that 3 veterans had witnessed everything from a black SUV, and they had plans that would turn his world upside down. Nathan Riley's small apartment came alive at 4:30 a.m. each morning, the quiet broken by the gentle sound of him preparing breakfast. The kitchen was cramped but spotless, with crayon drawings covering the refrigerator and a worn schedule pinned beside them. Each colorful masterpiece was signed in wobbly letters. Love, Bella. At the tiny kitchen table, he packed 2 lunches, one in a Power Rangers lunchbox for his 8-year-old daughter, the other in a weathered brown paper bag for himself. Isabella's mother had left them 3 years ago, leaving nothing but a note and a stack of unpaid bills. Since then, Nate had shaped his entire world around one purpose, giving Bella the stability and love she deserved. Their apartment wasn't much, a 2-bedroom walk-up on the outskirts of Milwaukee, but he'd managed to transform her small room into a princess castle, complete with twinkling lights and second-hand furniture he'd carefully restored on weekends. The morning routine was a delicate dance they'd perfected over the years. While Nate showered, Bella would wake up on her own, proud to be a big girl who could get herself ready for school. She'd inherited her father's determination, insisting on picking out her own clothes and making her bed, even if the corners weren't quite perfect. By the time Nate emerged from the bathroom, she'd be sitting at the kitchen table, legs swinging, ready for the breakfast he'd prepared. Their neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly retired teacher, would arrive at 5:45 a.m. sharp. She'd watch Bella until the school bus came, a kindness she'd offered when she learned of Nate's situation. He paid her what he could, but she often slipped the money back into Bella's lunchbox, claiming she'd found it on the floor. The arrangement allowed Nate to make it to Midwest Distribution Center by 6:30 a.m., where he'd worked for the past decade. The warehouse job wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough to keep them afloat. Nate worked in Section E, managing inventory and operating a forklift with a precision that had earned him Employee of the Month 3 times. His supervisor, Ray Tucker, ran a tight ship, enforcing company policies with an iron fist. 3 warnings sat in Nate's file, all from times he'd had to leave early when Bella was sick. One more strike, Tucker had warned, and he'd be out. Every evening, Nate would race home by 6 p.m., just in time for dinner with Bella. They'd sit at their small table, sharing stories about their day, while eating simple meals he'd learned to cook from YouTube videos. Bella would talk about her friends, her teachers, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian. Nate would listen, his exhaustion melting away at the sound of her animated chatter. After homework and dishes, their favorite ritual began. Nate would sit on the edge of Bella's bed, reading from a collection of used books he'd found at garage sales. They were halfway through The Chronicles of Narnia, with Bella insisting they could only read 1 chapter each night to make the story last longer. Some evenings, she'd ask about her mother, and Nate would carefully explain that sometimes grown-ups make choices they can't take back, but it doesn't mean they don't love their children. Late at night, after Bella was asleep, Nate would sit at the kitchen table with his bills spread out before him. The stack seemed to grow taller each month. Rent, utilities, grocery receipts, and the payments for Bella's asthma medication. He'd sort them meticulously, juggling due dates with paychecks, sometimes having to choose which bill could wait another week. The college fund he'd dreamed of starting for Bella remained an empty envelope in his dresser drawer, labeled Future Princess. Despite the struggles, Nate found joy in their little traditions. Sunday mornings were for pancakes with faces made of fruit. The last Saturday of each month, they'd visit the free day at the Children's Museum. He'd learned to braid hair by watching online tutorials, and though his attempts weren't perfect, Bella declared them better than any other dad's. Each small moment was a victory, a piece of the stable childhood he was determined to give her. At work, Nate kept to himself, focusing on efficiency and accuracy. His co-workers knew him as reliable, quiet, and always willing to cover an extra shift when someone needed it. The warehouse walls had heard 10 years of his footsteps, seen countless moments of him checking his phone during breaks, making sure Bella was okay. The job wasn't just about moving boxes or scanning inventory. It was the foundation that kept their small world turning. That Thursday morning had started like any other. Bella had hugged him extra tight, telling him about the science project she'd present that afternoon. Nate had smiled, straightened her slightly crooked ponytail, and promised to be home in time to hear all about it. He hadn't known then that by evening everything would change, that a single choice would challenge everything he'd built, threatening the fragile stability he'd created for his daughter. But sometimes life's biggest turns come disguised as ordinary days, and heroes are made in moments they never see coming. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on Nate's shoulders as he drove to work that morning, his old Honda Civic protesting with familiar squeaks and rattles. The check engine light had been blinking for weeks, but car repairs would have to wait. The radio crackled with the morning news as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising another stormy day. The weatherman's voice warned of heavy rainfall and possible flooding, making Nate grip the steering wheel tighter as he thought about the slick loading dock floors. His work locker held the few personal items he allowed himself at the warehouse: a water bottle, a spare pair of work gloves, and most importantly, a framed photo of Bella missing her front teeth, grinning proudly in her school picture from last year. Every morning, he'd touch the frame briefly before starting his shift, a reminder of why every box moved, every hour worked, mattered. His co-workers had their own rituals, their own reasons for being there, but few shared the quiet determination that drove Nate through each grueling day. The morning safety meeting had included a stern reminder about station protocols. Tucker had stared directly at Nate while emphasizing the importance of maintaining position during shifts. "No exceptions," he'd barked, his clipboard clutched like a shield against any possible deviation from company policy. The words echoed in Nate's mind as he made his way to Section E, unaware that fate was about to test his adherence to those very rules in ways he never could have imagined. The warehouse floor hummed with its usual morning activity as Nate settled into his routine at Section E. Forklifts beeped their warning signals, conveyor belts whirred steadily, and the occasional announcement crackled over the aging PA system. The loading dock doors were open wide, letting in the heavy morning air that promised rain. Steel support beams stretched overhead like industrial giants, their shadows creating a maze of light and darkness across the concrete floor. 10 years had taught Nate every quirk of this building: which dock door stuck slightly in humid weather, which forklift had a sensitive brake, and which corner of Section E caught the worst drafts during storms. He'd memorized the optimal routes between aisles, mastered the art of stacking pallets for maximum stability, and learned to predict busy rushes before they hit. This knowledge wasn't just about efficiency. It was about survival in a job where one mistake could mean the difference between keeping and losing your livelihood. Ray Tucker's morning inspection was as predictable as clockwork. The supervisor moved through the warehouse like a drill sergeant, his polished shoes clicking against concrete, clipboard clutched in his perpetually sweating hands. He had a way of appearing suddenly behind workers, measuring their startled reactions against his strict standards of professionalism. Today, his face carried an extra edge of tension. Corporate evaluators were expected sometime this week. "Riley?" Tucker's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Your section better be spotless. Corporate's watching everything this week." He adjusted his too-tight collar, a nervous tic everyone had learned to recognize. "And remember, no leaving your station. Period. We've had too many efficiency drops from people wandering off." His eyes lingered meaningfully on Nate's badge, where 3 written warnings were recorded in stark black numbers. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm, but there was an undercurrent of nervous energy throughout the warehouse. Workers moved with extra caution, triple-checking their stations and paperwork. The upcoming corporate evaluation had everyone on edge, especially after last month's announcement about potential operational streamlining, a fancy term that everyone knew meant possible job cuts. Around 10, the rain finally arrived. It started as a gentle patter against the metal roof, but quickly intensified into a thunderous downpour. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Water began collecting at the edges of the loading dock, despite the drainage systems. Yellow caution, wet floor signs appeared like mushrooms after rain, their warnings reflecting in growing puddles. The weather report on the break room radio warned of storms continuing throughout the day. Nate watched the clock tick toward lunch, thinking about Bella's science presentation. She'd worked so hard on her project about the water cycle, ironically fitting for today's weather. His phone sat silent in his pocket. No calls from Mrs. Chen meant everything was fine at school. Still, the parent in him always stayed alert, ready for any emergency that might need him to drop everything and run. The warehouse's public address system crackled to life. "Attention all personnel. Due to weather conditions, please exercise extra caution around loading areas. Customer pickup will continue as scheduled." The message repeated twice, its importance emphasized by the steady drum of rain on the roof. Tucker appeared again, ordering workers to double-check their safety protocols. Between moving shipments, Nate noticed unusual activity near the management offices. Men in expensive suits walked through, followed by Tucker, who had switched his usual clipboard for a leather portfolio. Corporate evaluators had arrived early, their presence adding another layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Workers straightened their uniforms and avoided eye contact, each focused intently on their tasks. The loading dock became increasingly treacherous as the rain continued. Water tracked in on shoes and wheels, created slick patches that required constant attention from the maintenance team. Safety had always been a point of pride for Nate. In 10 years, he'd never had an accident in his section. He watched customers carefully as they navigated the wet floors, ready to call out warnings if they got too close to dangerous areas. A flash of lightning illuminated the loading bay, followed by a tremendous crack of thunder that made several workers jump. The storm was directly overhead now, its intensity matching the growing pressure inside the warehouse. Tucker's voice carried across the floor as he led the corporate group through their inspection, his nervous laughter echoing off the high ceiling. Nate checked his watch. 4 more hours until his shift ended. 4 hours to maintain perfect protocol under corporate scrutiny. 4 hours until he could head home to hear about Bella's presentation. The thought of her excited face sharing every detail of her day kept him focused as he methodically worked through his tasks, unaware that the next few minutes would change everything. The rain drummed harder, thunder rolled overhead, and somewhere in the parking lot, a black SUV pulled into a visitor spot, its tinted windows hiding the observers inside. The stage was set for a moment that would test not just protocol, but the very essence of human compassion against the rigid rules of corporate policy. The loading bay doors framed sheets of falling rain like a grey curtain when the distinguished-looking man appeared. He moved with the measured precision of someone who had once commanded respect, though now his steps were cautious on the wet floor. His silver hair and ramrod-straight posture set him apart from the usual customers, as did the slight hesitation in his stride, barely noticeable unless you were watching carefully, as Nate was. Through the rain and shadows, Nate could make out what appeared to be military pins on the man's jacket lapel, catching dim light as he navigated between the yellow caution signs. The visitor held a pickup slip in one hand, while the other gripped a sleek black cane that seemed more ceremonial than functional. Something about his bearing reminded Nate of the veterans he'd seen at last year's Memorial Day parade, men who carried their service in their stance even years after leaving uniform. The warehouse intercom crackled again with another weather warning, but it was drowned out by a particularly violent crack of thunder. The sound echoed off the metal walls, and in that moment of natural percussion, Nate saw the man's cane slip on the wet concrete. Time seemed to slow as the visitor's composed facade crumbled, his body twisting awkwardly as he fought to maintain balance. "Sir, watch out!" Nate's voice carried across his section, but it was too late. The man's bad leg buckled, and he went down hard on the slick floor. The sound of his cane clattering across the concrete mixed with a sharp intake of breath that spoke of both pain and wounded pride. Papers scattered around him like fallen leaves, dancing in the damp breeze from the open bay doors. Nate's station was 30 feet away, a distance that had never seemed so vast. Company policy flashed through his mind in Tucker's voice. "Your station is your responsibility. Leave it and you're done." And 3 warnings already marked his record, each one a reminder of choosing his daughter over protocol. One more would mean termination, no questions asked. But as he watched the fallen man struggling to rise, other memories surfaced. Bella asking why some of her friends' dads walked funny after coming home from far away. The veterans at her school's career day, talking about sacrifice and duty, the way his own father, before passing, had taught him that being a man meant doing what's right, especially when it came at a cost. Through the rain-swept loading bay, Nate could see other workers turning away, suddenly intensely focused on their tasks. Tucker was still occupied with the corporate team on the far side of the warehouse, their suits dark smudges in the distance. The fallen man had managed to push himself to a sitting position, but his face was drawn with pain. One hand pressed against what Nate guessed was an old injury made fresh by the fall. Without conscious thought, Nate's feet were moving. The distance between his station and the fallen visitor disappeared under his steady stride. He could feel eyes on him, some sympathetic, others warning, but they mattered less than the grunt of pain from the man on the floor. As Nate knelt beside him, he caught a glimpse of the visitor's eyes. They held the same steady gaze he'd seen in old photos of his father in uniform. "Sir, try not to move too quickly," Nate said softly, already assessing the situation with the careful attention he used when Bella was sick. "I'm going to help you up, but we'll take it slow." His hand found the visitor's elbow, providing stable support without demanding surrender of dignity. Up close, he could see the man's jacket was expensive, custom-tailored, with a small American flag pin beside what looked like combat medals. "Riley!" Tucker's voice cut through the warehouse like a whip crack. "What the hell are you doing away from your station?" The supervisor's face was already flushed with anger as he broke away from the corporate group, making a beeline for Section E. His shoes squeaked against the wet floor, clipboard raised like a shield against insubordination. The fallen man tried to intercede, his voice carrying unexpected authority despite his position on the floor. "Your employee was just—" "Company policy is absolutely clear," Tucker interrupted. either missing or ignoring the steel in the visitor's tone. "Return to your station immediately, Riley. This is your final warning." Nate looked at the man beside him, then back at his station, where boxes were piling up on the conveyor belt. The choice crystallized in that moment: protocol or humanity, security or sacrifice. In his mind, he saw Bella's face, heard her voice asking why helping people was wrong. His grip on the visitor's arm remained steady. "I'm sorry, sir," Nate replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I won't leave him here injured." The words sealed his fate, but they felt right, as true as the lessons he taught his daughter about kindness and courage. Tucker's face darkened like the storm clouds overhead. "Then you're terminated. Clear out your locker after you finish playing hero." He stormed off, already pulling out termination forms, leaving Nate kneeling beside the fallen man in the rain-swept loading bay, both of their lives about to change in ways neither could imagine. Time seemed to slow in the moments after Tucker's pronouncement. The warehouse sounds, the beeping of forklifts, the hum of conveyor belts, the distant rumble of thunder faded into a muffled backdrop as reality sank in. Nate stayed focused on helping the injured man, who was now gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Let's get you somewhere dry, sir," Nate said, his voice steadier than he felt. With careful movements, he helped the visitor to his feet, noting how the man favored his right leg. The scattered papers were quickly gathered, though some were already spotted with rain. The black cane, when Nate retrieved it, was heavier than he'd expected. Not decorative after all, but a well-crafted tool of necessity. "The first aid station is this way," Nate continued, gesturing toward a small office near the front of the warehouse. Other workers watched their slow progress, their faces a mix of sympathy and relief that they weren't in his position. Through the windows of the management office, Tucker could be seen furiously filling out paperwork, his face still flushed with anger. The first aid station was quiet and mercifully dry. As Nate helped the man settle into a chair, he caught a better glimpse of the medals on his jacket. They spoke of significant service, of battles fought far from this warehouse's fluorescent lights. The visitor's bearing remained dignified despite his obvious discomfort. "I'm General William Hawthorne," the man said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command even in pain. "And you just lost your job helping me, son." There was something in his tone, not pity, but a sharp understanding that made Nate straighten unconsciously. "Nathan Riley, sir, and I'd do it again." The words came naturally, even as his mind raced through calculations of bills, rent, and Bella's needs. The first aid kit yielded an ice pack, which the general accepted with a slight nod. "Family?" The question was direct, military precise. "A daughter, Isabella. She's 8. Nate's throat tightened as he thought of having to tell her they might need to move, to leave her school and friends, because Daddy had broken the rules. The general's eyes narrowed slightly at this information, his expression unreadable. The warehouse nurse arrived then, fussing over the general with professional efficiency. Nate used the moment to step outside, needing air that didn't smell of antiseptic and lost opportunities. The rain had finally begun to slack, though dark clouds still loomed overhead. Through the loading bay doors, he could see 3 figures standing near a black SUV, their stances suggesting military background even in civilian clothes. Tucker intercepted him before he could return to his locker. "Here's your termination paperwork," he said, thrusting a manila envelope forward. "Clear out your things and leave the premises immediately." The supervisor's voice carried a hint of satisfaction that made Nate's jaw clench. The walk to his locker felt like a funeral march. 10 years of his life stored in a small metal box, the photo of Bella, his spare work gloves, a half-empty water bottle. As he packed them into a cardboard box someone had silently left by his station, co-workers passed by with whispered words of support and hurried handshakes. One slipped him a business card for another warehouse that was hiring. Another promised to be a reference. His fingers lingered on the locker door before closing it one last time. The sound of the latch clicking shut echoed with finality. The box was pathetically light in his arms as he walked toward the exit, past the section he'd managed for a decade. The conveyor belt had already been reassigned to another worker, the transition seamless as if he'd never been there. In the parking lot, the rain had reduced to a fine mist. Nate's Civic sat where he'd parked it that morning when his biggest worry had been Bella's science presentation. Now, as he placed the box in the passenger seat, his mind spun with larger concerns. The mortgage payment was due next week. Bella's asthma medication needed refilling. The electricity bill sat unopened on the kitchen counter. He checked his phone 2 hours before Bella's school let out. 2 hours to figure out how to tell his daughter that everything was about to change. The screen showed a text from Mrs. Chen about Bella's successful presentation, complete with a smiling emoji. The normalcy of it made his chest ache. Starting the car, Nate caught movement in his rearview mirror. The 3 figures he'd noticed earlier were walking toward the first aid station, their movements coordinated with military precision. The black SUV gleamed wetly in the pale light, breaking through the clouds. Something about their purposeful stride made him pause, but he pushed the thought away. He had more immediate concerns than mysterious observers. As he pulled out of the parking lot, Nate passed the warehouse sign one last time. 10 years summed up in a cardboard box and a termination notice. The rain started again. Lighter now, as if the storm too had spent its fury. He turned toward home, his mind already working on plans and possibilities, unaware that the next 48 hours would reshape his world in ways he couldn't imagine. Behind him, in the first aid station, General Hawthorne watched his departure through the window. The general's phone lay open on the table, a text message displayed. Background check complete. He's perfect. Outside, the black SUV's engine hummed to life. The drive home felt surreal, each familiar street sign and traffic light a reminder of how quickly life could change. Nate's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white against the worn leather. The cardboard box on the passenger seat seemed to mock him with its lightness. 10 years reduced to a few personal items and a termination notice. The digital clock on his dashboard read 2:45 p.m. Bella would be finishing her science presentation now, probably beaming with pride as she explained the water cycle to her classmates. The thought of her excited face made his throat tighten. He pulled into the parking lot of the small park they sometimes visited, needing a moment to collect himself before facing Mrs. Chen. Rain tapped gently against the car roof as Nate pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. The list of people he could call was painfully short. Most of his friends were at the warehouse, and he couldn't bring himself to reach out to them yet. His savings account held enough for maybe 2 months of expenses if they were extremely careful. The local temp agencies might have warehouse work, but they paid less and offered no benefits. The termination papers sat heavily in their manila envelope. Nate forced himself to read through them, noting Tucker's sharp, angry handwriting. Violation of station protocol. Insubordination. Unauthorized abandonment of post. The words felt cold, clinical, nothing about the injured man or the choice between rules and basic human decency. A text from Mrs. Chen lit up his phone. Bella got an A+ on her presentation. She can't wait to tell you all about it. Attached was a photo of his daughter, grinning beside her poster board, decorated with cotton ball clouds and blue paper raindrops. The sight nearly broke him. He had to pull himself together. Bella would read his face the moment he walked through the door. The drive to their apartment was automatic, muscle memory guiding him through streets he'd traveled thousands of times. As he parked, he noticed an unfamiliar black SUV in the visitor's lot, similar to the one from the warehouse. The coincidence prickled at the back of his neck, but he dismissed it. His mind was searching for patterns in chaos, trying to make sense of a senseless day. Mrs. Chen was waiting at her door when he climbed the stairs. Her friendly smile faltered when she saw his face, then the box in his arms. "Nathan, you're home early." Her voice trailed off, understanding dawning in her kind eyes. She had been a teacher long enough to read people well. "Could you—" Nate's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Could you keep Bella for an extra hour after school? I need to figure out how to tell her." Of course, Mrs. Chen nodded quickly. "We'll have cookies and milk. Take the time you need." She hesitated, then added softly, "Whatever happened, I know you did the right thing. You always do." Inside his apartment, the silence was deafening. Bella's breakfast dishes were still in the drying rack. Had it really been only this morning that he'd watched her carefully pour her own milk, proud of her growing independence? The refrigerator hummed, magnets holding up her artwork, school notices, and the calendar that marked their routines. He'd have to revise those routines now. Nate placed the box on the kitchen table and began emptying it. Each item seemed to carry the weight of memory. The photo of Bella that had watched over him for years, his spare work gloves still bearing the faint impressions of countless boxes moved, the water bottle Bella had decorated with stickers last Father's Day. At the bottom, he found something unexpected, a business card he hadn't placed there. The card was heavy, cream-colored cardstock with raised lettering in deep navy blue. "Veterans Alliance Foundation," it read, with General William Hawthorne, director, below. On the back, in precise handwriting, "Tomorrow, 9 a.m., we have much to discuss." A phone number followed. Nate stared at the card, turning it over in his hands. He hadn't seen the general slip it into his box. Perhaps one of the figures from the SUV had done it. The questions multiplying in his mind were interrupted by his phone buzzing. A text from an unknown number. "Black SUV will pick you up at 8:30 a.m. Your daughter's school attendance has been arranged." The mix of efficiency and presumption in the message was startling. How did they know about Bella's school? Why were they interested in him? The questions swirled as he looked around his small apartment, at the bills on the counter and the empty college fund envelope in the drawer. What choice did he really have? Thunder rumbled in the distance, an echo of the storm that had started this whole chain of events. In 3 hours, Bella would burst through the door, excited to share her triumph. Tonight, he'd have to explain why Daddy wouldn't be going to work tomorrow, but somehow, holding the heavy cardstock between his fingers, Nate felt the first flickering of hope. Sometimes, he thought, the end of one road reveals the beginning of another. In the visitors' parking lot, the black SUV remained, its windows tinted against curious eyes, waiting with military patience for morning to come. The conversation with Bella went both better and worse than Nate had imagined. She sat at their small kitchen table, her science project poster board propped against the wall behind her, half-eaten cookies from Mrs. Chen's forgotten, as she listened to her father explain. Her dark eyes, so much like her mother's, watched him with that uncanny perception that sometimes made him forget she was only 8. "But you helped someone who was hurt," she said finally, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Like when Jenny fell at recess and I got the teacher, even though we're not supposed to leave the playground." The simple logic of children. Nate felt his throat tighten again. "That's different, sweetheart," he tried to explain, but Bella shook her head firmly, her ponytail swishing with the movement. "Mrs. Martinez says doing the right thing is always right, even when it's hard." She reached across the table and placed her small hand over his. "Are we going to be okay, Daddy?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "We're always okay when we're together, Princess," he managed, hoping his voice sounded steadier than it felt. "And tomorrow. Tomorrow I have a meeting that might help us figure things out." Bella's eyes lit up with interest. "Is that why there's a big black car outside? Jimmy from 4B said it looks like the ones in spy movies. Trust a child to notice everything and share it on the playground." Something like that, Nate hedged, glancing at the business card now propped against their napkin holder. How about we celebrate your A-plus presentation with breakfast for dinner? You can tell me all about how you explained the water cycle. The evening passed in a blur of pancakes, proud explanations of condensation and precipitation, and their usual bedtime routine. Bella insisted on reading an extra chapter of their current book, perhaps sensing her father needed the comfort of normalcy as much as she did. When she finally drifted off, Nate stood in her doorway, watching her sleep, the soft glow of her nightlight casting shadows on walls decorated with her drawings. Back in the kitchen, he spread out everything he'd need for tomorrow. His best dress shirt, slightly worn at the cuffs but still presentable, the tie he'd worn to his last job interview years ago, polished shoes that pinched slightly. The General's business card sat in the center of this careful arrangement, its crisp edges and raised lettering speaking of power and purpose. A soft knock at the door startled him. Through the peephole, he saw Mrs. Chen holding a covered dish. When he opened the door, the smell of homemade dumplings filled the hallway. "For tomorrow's lunch," she said firmly, pressing the container into his hands. "My mother always said, important meetings need good food." Before he could protest, she added, "I'll take Bella to school in the morning. Jimmy's mother told me about the car watching our building. Better not to have too many questions from curious children." Nate felt a rush of gratitude for this woman who'd become like family. "Mrs. Chen, She waved away his thanks. "You're a good man, Nathan Riley. Like my David was. He served in Vietnam, you know. He always said you can tell a person's character by what they do when no one is watching." She patted his arm. "Or when everyone is watching but looking away." After she left, Nate spent hours at the kitchen table, alternating between studying the business card and making contingency plans. He updated his resume, though something told him tomorrow's meeting wouldn't involve a typical job interview. He wrote down every question he could think of, then crossed most of them out, knowing some answers needed to be earned rather than asked for. Around midnight, he found himself standing at the window, looking down at the black SUV still parked in the visitor's spot. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the streetlights like mirrors. In one of them, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure doing a perimeter check with military precision. These people, whoever they were, took their tasks seriously. His phone buzzed one last time for the night. 08:30 tomorrow. Dress comfortably, but it may be a long day. The message was signed simply M.R. Major Alexandra Reeves, he assumed, one of the names he'd caught glimpses of during his frantic evening research into the Veterans Alliance Foundation. In Bella's room, he heard her stir and murmur in her sleep. The sound centered him as it had so many times before. Whatever tomorrow brought, every decision would be made with her future in mind. He touched the phone in his pocket, thinking of the strange text messages and mysterious observers. 10 years at the warehouse had taught him to be cautious, to follow rules, to keep his head down. But today's choice, helping the general despite the consequences, had felt more right than any rule he'd ever followed. Perhaps that meant tomorrow's uncertainty was worth embracing. As midnight ticked past, Nate finally prepared for bed, setting his alarm earlier than usual. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was the general's card catching moonlight on his nightstand, its raised lettering holding promises, or perhaps challenges, that would begin to unfold in just a few hours. In the parking lot below, the black SUV maintained its vigilant watch, its occupants rotating shifts with military efficiency, waiting for the dawn that would change not just one man's life, but countless others, through a chain of events set in motion by a single act of kindness in the rain. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the black SUV pulled up in front of Nate's apartment building. The driver, a woman with close-cropped hair and ramrod-straight posture, opened the rear door without a word. She moved with the fluid efficiency that marked military training, her civilian clothes doing little to disguise her bearing. Nate had been ready since dawn, his ironed shirt feeling stiff and formal after years of warehouse uniforms. Mrs. Chen had already taken Bella to school, armed with a cover story about a job interview to satisfy curious children. The morning goodbye had been normal, almost too normal, with Bella giving him her usual hug and a whispered, "Good luck, Daddy." The SUV's interior was immaculate, all black leather and tinted windows. As they pulled away from the curb, Nate noticed two things. The driver was wearing a discreet earpiece, and there was another vehicle following them at a precise distance. Whatever this was, it wasn't a typical job interview. They drove for 45 minutes, leaving Milwaukee's familiar streets for the outskirts of the city. The urban landscape gave way to increasingly secure-looking facilities, ending at a modern complex surrounded by tastefully landscaped grounds and subtle but effective security measures. The sign at the entrance read, "Veterans Alliance Foundation," in dignified letters. "We're here, Mr. Riley," the driver announced, pulling up to a side entrance. "Major Reeves is waiting for you in the East Wing." She handed him a visitor's badge that already had his photo on it, a detail that didn't escape his notice. The building's interior was a blend of military precision and corporate comfort. Clean lines and modern art mixed with carefully placed photographs of service members and ceremonial flags. A young man in pressed khakis appeared at Nate's elbow, introducing himself as Lieutenant Cooper, today's escort. They walked through corridors that hummed with purposeful activity. Everyone they passed moved with that same military bearing, though most wore civilian clothes. Some nodded in recognition at Nate, as if they'd been expecting him. The air of quiet competence was a far cry from the warehouse's controlled chaos. Lieutenant Cooper led him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a courtyard. General Hawthorne was already there, standing despite his injury from yesterday. He looked even more imposing in full military dress, his medals catching the morning light. Beside him stood a woman Nate assumed was Major Reeves, her appearance matching her precise text messages. "Mr. Riley," the general acknowledged, gesturing to a chair, "thank you for joining us." The formality in his voice was tempered by something else, approval perhaps, or anticipation. "How's the leg, sir?" Nate asked, genuine concern overriding his nervousness. The general's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Better thanks to your timely assistance, though I must confess," he exchanged glances with Major Reeves. "Yesterday's incident wasn't entirely coincidental. Nate's suspicions from the previous day crystallized. You were testing me." "Observing," Major Reeves corrected, her voice carrying the same efficiency as her texts. "We've been watching several candidates. You're the only one who acted without hesitation, despite clear personal risk." The general lowered himself into a chair, signaling the others to sit. "The Veterans Alliance Foundation has a significant problem, Mr. Riley, one that someone with your particular qualities might help us solve." Major Reeves activated a wall screen, displaying statistics and photographs. "We serve over 100,000 veterans annually, providing everything from medical care to job placement, but we're failing one crucial demographic." She highlighted a section of data. "Recent veterans, particularly those with families, aren't connecting with our services. They're falling through the cracks." "They don't trust easily," the general added, his voice softening. "Can't blame them. War changes you, makes it hard to believe anyone understands, especially civilians in suits telling you they want to help." Nate studied the data on the screen, his warehouse experience with inventory management helping him spot patterns. These numbers show high initial contact but low follow-through. They're reaching out once, but not coming back. Why? "That's exactly the question we need answered," Major Reeves nodded approvingly. "We have the resources, the programs, the facilities. What we lack is the human connection, someone who understands both sides of the divide." The general leaned forward, his eyes intent. Someone who sees people, not problems, who acts on principle, even at personal cost. Someone who understands sacrifice and family responsibility. He paused meaningfully. Someone like you. But I'm not a veteran, Nate pointed out, though his mind was already processing the challenge, seeing the possibilities. No, Major Reeves agreed. But you're something equally valuable, a bridge. Someone who can translate between our world and theirs. She placed a folder on the table. We want you to help us redesign our family support programs, full authority, substantial resources, and complete backing from the foundation. The general tapped the folder. The salary is significantly more than your warehouse position. Full benefits, including comprehensive medical coverage for you and Isabella, and a flexible schedule. We understand the importance of family commitments. Nate opened the folder, his eyes widening at the figures. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a life-changing opportunity. But something else caught his attention. The proposed program ideas, the focus on practical support over paperwork, the emphasis on treating people with dignity. Outside the window, he could see other veterans arriving for various programs. Some moved stiffly, others bore visible scars, but all carried themselves with that distinct military bearing. They'd served their country, and now they were trying to rebuild their lives, just as he was trying to build a secure future for Bella. The general watched him studying the scene. Sometimes the right person for a mission isn't the obvious choice, he said quietly. Sometimes it's the person who simply proves through their actions that they understand what really matters. At precisely 8:30 a.m., the black SUV pulled up in front of Nate's apartment building. The driver, a woman with close-cropped hair and ramrod-straight posture, opened the rear door without a word. She moved with the fluid efficiency that marked military training, her civilian clothes doing little to disguise her bearing. Nate had been ready since dawn, his ironed shirt feeling stiff and formal after years of warehouse uniforms. Mrs. Chen had already taken Bella to school, armed with a cover story about a job interview to satisfy curious children. The morning goodbye had been normal, almost too normal, with Bella giving him her usual hug and a whispered, "Good luck, Daddy." The SUV's interior was immaculate, all black leather and tinted windows. As they pulled away from the curb, Nate noticed two things. The driver was wearing a discreet earpiece, and there was another vehicle following them at a precise distance. Whatever this was, it wasn't a typical job interview. They drove for 45 minutes, leaving Milwaukee's familiar streets for the outskirts of the city. The urban landscape gave way to increasingly secure-looking facilities, ending at a modern complex surrounded by tastefully landscaped grounds and subtle but effective security measures. The sign at the entrance read, "Veterans Alliance Foundation," in dignified letters. "We're here, Mr. Riley," the driver announced, pulling up to a side entrance. "Major Reeves is waiting for you in the East Wing." She handed him a visitor's badge that already had his photo on it, a detail that didn't escape his notice. The building's interior was a blend of military precision and corporate comfort. Clean lines and modern art mixed with carefully placed photographs of service members and ceremonial flags. A young man in pressed khakis appeared at Nate's elbow, introducing himself as Lieutenant Cooper, today's escort. They walked through corridors that hummed with purposeful activity. Everyone they passed moved with that same military bearing, though most wore civilian clothes. Some nodded in recognition at Nate, as if they'd been expecting him. The air of quiet competence was a far cry from the warehouse's controlled chaos. Lieutenant Cooper led him to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a courtyard. General Hawthorne was already there, standing despite his injury from yesterday. He looked even more imposing in full military dress, his medals catching the morning light. Beside him stood a woman Nate assumed was Major Reeves, her appearance matching her precise text messages. "Mr. Riley," The general acknowledged, gesturing to a chair. "Thank you for joining us." The formality in his voice was tempered by something else, approval perhaps, or anticipation. "How's the leg, sir?" Nate asked, genuine concern overriding his nervousness. The general's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Better, thanks to your timely assistance, though I must confess," he exchanged glances with Major Reeves, "yesterday's incident wasn't entirely coincidental." Nate's suspicions from the previous day crystallized. "You were testing me." "Observing," Major Reeves corrected, her voice carrying the same efficiency as her texts. "We've been watching several candidates. You're the only one who acted without hesitation, despite clear personal risk." The general lowered himself into a chair, signaling the others to sit. "The Veterans Alliance Foundation has a significant problem, Mr. Riley. One that someone with your particular qualities might help us solve." Major Reeves activated a wall screen displaying statistics and photographs. "We serve over 100,000 veterans annually, providing everything from medical care to job placement. But we're failing one crucial demographic." She highlighted a section of data. "Recent veterans, particularly those with families, aren't connecting with our services. They're falling through the cracks." "They don't trust easily," the general added, his voice softening. "Can't blame them. War changes you, makes it hard to believe anyone understands, especially civilians in suits telling you they want to help." Nate studied the data on the screen, his warehouse experience with inventory management helping him spot patterns. "These numbers show high initial contact but low follow-through. They're reaching out once, but not coming back. Why?" "That's exactly the question we need answered." Major Reeves nodded approvingly. "We have the resources, the programs, the facilities. What we lack is the human connection, someone who understands both sides of the divide." The general leaned forward, his eyes intent. "Someone who sees people, not problems, who acts on principle, even at personal cost. Someone who understands sacrifice and family responsibility." He paused meaningfully. "Someone like you." "But I'm not a veteran," Nate pointed out, though his mind was already processing the challenge, seeing the possibilities. "No," Major Reeves agreed, "but you're something equally valuable. A bridge. Someone who can translate between our world and theirs." She placed a folder on the table. "We want you to help us redesign our family support programs. Full authority, substantial resources, and complete backing from the foundation." The general tapped the folder. "The salary is significantly more than your warehouse position. Full benefits, including comprehensive medical coverage for you and Isabella, and a flexible schedule. We understand the importance of family commitments." Nate opened the folder, his eyes widening at the figures. This wasn't just a job offer, it was a life-changing opportunity. But something else caught his attention. The proposed program ideas, the focus on practical support over paperwork, the emphasis on treating people with dignity. Outside the window, he could see other veterans arriving for various programs. Some moved stiffly, others bore visible scars, but all carried themselves with that distinct military bearing. They'd served their country, and now they were trying to rebuild their lives, just as he was trying to build a secure future for Bella. The general watched him studying the scene. "Sometimes the right person for a mission isn't the obvious choice," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's the person who simply proves, through their actions, that they understand what really matters." "Before you make your decision," Major Reeves said, pressing a button on the conference room table, "there's something else you should see." The wall panel slid aside, revealing a large monitor displaying security footage from the warehouse. Nate recognized himself at his station the moment before everything changed. The footage played from multiple angles, professionally edited to show the complete sequence of events. But there was something different about these images. They captured details he hadn't noticed in the chaos of the moment, the random placement of wet floor signs that had created a particular path, the timing of the corporate visit that had ensured Tucker's heightened state of anxiety, even the angle of the loading bay doors that had allowed the perfect amount of rain to make the floor treacherous. "You set the whole thing up," Nate said slowly, watching the scene unfold. "But the general really did fall." "I most certainly did," General Hawthorne confirmed, rubbing his leg with a grimace. "Though I'll admit, the rain made it a bit more convincing than intended. Sometimes the best plans have a way of becoming all too real." Colonel Harrison, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. "We've been conducting these field evaluations across the country, Mr. Riley, testing different candidates in different scenarios. Most people either follow protocol blindly or help for the wrong reasons, looking for recognition or reward." Major Reeves pulled up another set of files on the screen. "Your background check was extensive. 10 years of consistent work, raising your daughter alone, helping neighbors like Mrs. Chen with small repairs, despite your own limited resources. A pattern of quiet integrity that matched what we were looking for." The screen changed to show more footage. Nate helping elderly customers with heavy boxes when no one was watching, staying late to cover for co-workers with family emergencies. Small acts of kindness that he'd never thought anyone had noticed. "We had 5 other candidates in the Milwaukee area," Colonel Harrison continued, "all with similar positions, similar circumstances. Only you acted without calculation, without weighing the professional consequences against the human need." The general stood, moving to the window overlooking the courtyard. This foundation was built on the principle that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of something crucial: the human element. We became exactly what many veterans fear: another bureaucracy, more focused on protocols than people. He turned back to Nate, his expression serious. "Your daughter asked you last night if doing the right thing is always right, even when it's hard. She understands something many adults forget: that true character isn't about following rules, it's about following your conscience." Nate felt a chill. "You heard that conversation?" Major Reeves had the grace to look slightly apologetic. "Standard security protocol for final candidates. We needed to understand your complete character, including how you handle personal crises." "Your apartment wasn't bugged," Colonel Harrison added quickly, "just standard surveillance on the building's exterior. Though I must say, your daughter's logic about the playground incident was quite compelling." The general retrieved another folder from a side table. "This is our real proposal, Mr. Riley. Not just a job, but a partnership. We want you to help us rebuild our family support programs from the ground up. Your experience, both personal and professional, gives you insights our military perspective sometimes misses." The new folder contained detailed plans for community outreach centers, family support networks, and practical assistance programs. The scope was far larger than Nate had initially imagined. "The warehouse incident proved what we suspected," Major Reeves explained. "You have an instinctive understanding of what we're trying to achieve. You see the person behind the problem, the family behind the file number." "Why go to all this trouble?" Nate asked, gesturing at the security footage. "Why not just conduct normal interviews?" The general smiled slightly. "Because normal interviews don't reveal character, Mr. Riley. They reveal preparation. We needed someone who would act with integrity, even when they thought no one was watching. Someone who would choose right over easy, compassion over compliance." Colonel Harrison stepped forward, adding, "The foundation is at a crucial turning point. We have the resources, the infrastructure, and the commitment. What we need now is the heart, someone who can help us remember why we started this mission in the first place." Through the window, Nate watched as a young veteran helped his wife unload their children from a car, his movements stiff but determined. The scene could have been him and Bella, facing an uncertain future with nothing but determination and hope. "The salary and benefits are significant," Major Reeves noted, "but we hope that's not why you'll accept. We're offering you a chance to turn yesterday's moment of compassion into a lifetime of meaningful change." The general extended his hand, his eyes holding the weight of command and the warmth of understanding. "What do you say, Mr. Riley? Ready to help us remember what service really means?" Nate stared at the general's extended hand, feeling the weight of the moment. Through the conference room windows, he could see more veterans arriving with their families, each group carrying visible and invisible burdens. The scene reminded him of his own daily struggles, of the quiet dignity required to keep going when life became challenging. "Before I answer," Nate said carefully, "I need to understand something." He turned to face the group fully. "Yesterday's test. How many other people have lost their jobs during these evaluations?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. It was Major Reeves who recovered first. Every candidate who failed to act was quietly compensated with a better position at another company, she explained, pulling up additional files on the screen. "We're thorough in our methods, Mr. Riley, but not cruel. Even those who chose protocol over compassion were ensured soft landings, though I must say you're the first candidate to ask about others' welfare before accepting the offer." The general's smile suggested this response had only confirmed their choice. That concern for others, even theoretical others, is exactly why we need you. Our current programs are efficient but often impersonal. We track numbers, measure outcomes, file reports, but we sometimes forget about the human cost of transition. Colonel Harrison moved to the conference table, spreading out a series of photographs. They showed veterans and their families in various stages of adjustment to civilian life, some struggling, some succeeding, all carrying the unique burden of service and sacrifice. "These are from our current family support centers," he explained. "We provide housing assistance, job placement, medical care, all the practical necessities. But look at their faces." He pointed to several images. "They're grateful for the help, but they don't feel understood. They're getting services, but not support. There's a difference." Nate picked up one photo, a young veteran trying to help his daughter with homework while clearly struggling with his own challenges. The scene hit close to home. They need someone who sees them as people first, not cases to be managed. "Exactly," the general confirmed. "Our current staff is highly qualified, deeply committed, but sometimes too focused on protocols and procedures. We need someone who understands that sometimes rules need to bend to accommodate human dignity." Major Reeves pulled up another document on the screen, a preliminary outline for a new family support initiative. "We want you to start here," she explained. "Redesign our approach from the ground up. Your experience juggling work and single parenthood, understanding financial constraints, maintaining dignity under pressure. These aren't just personal challenges, they're insights our programs desperately need." The scope of the project was both daunting and exciting. The outline included community outreach programs, school support systems, practical assistance networks, all the things Nate had wished existed during his own struggles. "You wouldn't be doing this alone," Colonel Harrison added, sensing Nate's momentary overwhelm. "You'll have a full team, complete resources, and our total support. What we need is your perspective, your understanding of what families really need when they're facing challenges." Through the window, Nate watched as a volunteer helped a veteran's wife unload groceries from a car, her children clutching homework sheets and looking uncertain in their new surroundings. The scene crystallized something in his mind. "They need more than services," he said slowly, the ideas forming as he spoke. "They need connection, understanding, someone who sees their strength, not just their struggles." He turned back to the group. "And their children, Need to see that change isn't always bad, that challenges can lead to opportunities. The general nodded approvingly. That's exactly the insight we've been missing. Our current programs are built on military efficiency, excellent for logistics, less effective for healing. Nate looked down at the folder containing his job offer, then at the photos spread across the table. Each face told a story of transition, of courage, of families trying to rebuild. His warehouse job had been about moving boxes. This would be about moving lives forward. "When can I start?" he asked, extending his hand to the general. The relief in the room was palpable. Major Reeves immediately began outlining the next steps, paperwork to complete, teams to meet, systems to learn. But the general held up his hand, pausing the efficient flow of military planning. "First," he said, looking at Nate with understanding, "go pick up your daughter from school. Take the afternoon to explain things to her. Help her understand that sometimes losing something leads to finding a greater purpose." He smiled slightly. After all, she's the one who reminded us that doing the right thing is always right, even when it's hard. The black SUV was already waiting to take Nate home, but this time it felt less mysterious, more like a bridge between his old life and the new opportunity ahead. As he gathered his things, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He stood straighter now, the weight of uncertainty replaced by the strength of purpose. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Bella can't wait to hear about your day. Neither can I." The future suddenly felt full of possibility, not just for him and Bella, but for all the families he might help support through their own transitions. The black SUV pulled up in front of Bella's school just as the final bell rang. Nate had texted Mrs. Chen that he would pick up Bella himself, wanting to share this moment personally. As he waited, he watched other parents greeting their children, seeing their interactions in a new light, each family carrying their own stories, their own struggles and triumphs. When Bella burst through the school doors, her backpack bouncing and her ponytail swinging, Nate felt a surge of emotion. She stopped short at the sight of the SUV, then broke into a run when she spotted him. "Daddy, is this part of your spy mission?" she whispered loudly as she hugged him, drawing amused looks from nearby parents. "Not exactly, Princess," he laughed, helping her into the car. "But I do have something important to tell you." The driver, the same woman from this morning, gave Bella a warm smile through the rearview mirror, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the Foundation's attention to detail. Instead of heading home, they drove to Bella's favorite park. The rain had cleared, leaving the afternoon sun to sparkle off puddles and wet playground equipment. They sat at their usual bench, the one with the view of both the swings and the duck pond. "Remember how you said doing the right thing is always right?" Nate began, watching his daughter's face carefully. "Well, some very special people agreed with you. They've asked me to help them with something important." Bella's eyes widened as Nate explained about the Veterans Alliance Foundation, translating the complex work into terms an 8-year-old could understand. "Like how you help me when things are hard," she asked, processing the information in her own way. "But for whole families." "Exactly like that," Nate smiled, amazed at her intuition. "And the best part is, we won't have to worry about money for your medicine anymore. We might even be able to get a bigger apartment, closer to your school." To his surprise, Bella's face grew serious. "But what about Mrs. Chen? She'll be lonely if we move." The concern for others, even in the midst of good news, made Nate's heart swell with pride. "Actually," he said, "the Foundation has some ideas about that too." He explained how they wanted to create community connections, perhaps even involving people like Mrs. Chen in their programs. They think her experience helping families like ours could be valuable. As they talked, Nate noticed the black SUV remained parked discreetly in the lot, its presence now feeling more protective than mysterious. Another vehicle had joined it, this one containing Colonel Harrison, who gave a subtle nod when he caught Nate's eye. They spent an hour at the park, Bella alternating between playing on the swings and returning to ask more questions. Each query showed her working to understand this change in their lives. "Will you help soldiers learn to smile again?" she asked at one point. "Like how you helped me smile after Mommy left?" The question caught him off guard with its depth. "That's exactly what we're going to try to do, Princess," he managed, pulling her close. "Help families remember how to smile again." As the sun began to set, they drove to their apartment building. Mrs. Chen was waiting, trying to appear casual but clearly bursting with curiosity. The foundation had already contacted her, exploring the possibility of incorporating her experience into their community outreach programs. "See," she said to Nate, her eyes twinkling. "Good things come to good people. My David would have approved." She pressed a box of freshly made dumplings into their hands, her way of celebrating good news. That evening, as Bella did her homework at the kitchen table, Nate began sorting through the materials the foundation had sent home with him. Program outlines, family support initiatives, community integration plans. Each document represented an opportunity to help others navigate the challenges he understood so well. His phone buzzed with a message from Major Reeves. "Team orientation tomorrow, 0900. Bring your daughter. We have some ideas for after-school programs we'd like her input on." The Foundation's commitment to including families in their planning was already evident. Looking around their small apartment, Nate saw it differently now. The worn furniture and cramped spaces had always represented their limitations. Now they told a story of resilience, of a father and daughter who had held on to hope and kindness despite their struggles. It was this understanding he could bring to his new role, the knowledge that behind every file was a family trying their best to build a better life. Bella's voice broke into his thoughts. "Daddy, can I make cards for the soldiers' kids so they know they're not alone?" She was already pulling out her art supplies, her mind working on ways to help others even as her own life was changing. "That's a wonderful idea, Princess," Nate said, watching as she began drawing careful rainbows on folded paper. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight was for this, for watching his daughter turn compassion into action, for feeling the pieces of their life shift into a better pattern. Outside, the black SUV remained on guard, its presence now a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes come disguised as ordinary moments, and that kindness, even in the rain, has a way of coming full circle. The Veterans Alliance Foundation's main office buzzed with energy on a bright autumn morning. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new office, Nate could see families arriving for the day's programs. His desk, once cluttered with preliminary proposals and planning documents, now held success stories and thank-you letters from families whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's renewed approach. The Family Integration Program, as they'd named it, had transformed over the past 3 months. What started as an idea born from a moment of kindness in the rain had grown into a comprehensive support system that bridged the gap between military precision and human connection. The Foundation's statistics showed a marked increase in family participation and, more importantly, in long-term engagement with their services. Mr. Riley, his assistant, a veteran spouse herself, appeared at the door. "The new family is here for orientation, and General Hawthorne would like to sit in, if you don't mind." Nate straightened his tie, still not quite used to wearing one, and gathered his materials. The conference room had been redesigned under his guidance, replacing the stark military efficiency with a warmer, more welcoming atmosphere. Children's artwork, including several of Bella's original welcome cards, decorated one wall. The other displayed photographs of successful transitions, families who had found their footing with the Foundation's help. The new family sat nervously at the table, a former Marine sergeant, his wife, and their two young children. The tension in their postures was familiar to Nate. He'd seen it countless times now. The father's hands gripped his service documents too tightly. The mother's smile was slightly strained, and the children sat unusually still, reading the room with the heightened awareness that often came with military family life. "Welcome to your new beginning," Nate started, using the phrase that had become the program's unofficial motto. "I'm Nathan Riley, and I want you to know something important. We see you, not just your service record, not just your needs assessment, but you." General Hawthorne, who had quietly entered the room, nodded approvingly from his position near the door. The Foundation's approach had undergone a complete transformation under Nate's guidance. Instead of starting with paperwork and procedures, they began with people and possibilities. "3 months ago, I was working in a warehouse," Nate continued, watching the family relax slightly at his honesty. "I learned something important there, that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. That's what we want to offer you here." He proceeded to outline their programs, but not with the usual bureaucratic overview. Instead, he shared stories, real examples of families who had found their way forward. He talked about the children's support groups that Bella had helped design, where kids could share their experiences with others who understood. He mentioned the spouse networking programs, the practical assistance networks, the community integration initiatives. The Marine's wife spoke up hesitantly, "But how do you know what we really need? How can you understand?" Nate smiled, remembering asking similar questions 3 months ago. "Because we listen, really listen. Every family's journey is different, but the need for understanding is universal. We've built our programs around that principle." He showed them the community center, where Mrs. Chen now ran a grandparent connection program, matching elderly community members with military families who had moved away from their support systems. He explained the school liaison program that helped children transition between districts, inspired by Bella's own experiences with change. As they toured the facility, Nate pointed out the practical support services, job training, medical assistance, housing support, but emphasized how each was tailored to individual family needs. "We're not here to process you through a system," he explained. "We're here to walk beside you while you build your new normal." The Marine's shoulders gradually loosened. His wife's smile became more genuine, and their children began asking questions about the youth programs they could see through the activity room windows. The transformation Nate had witnessed so many times over the past 3 months was beginning again. Back in his office later, General Hawthorne stopped by. "You've created something remarkable here, Riley," he said, looking out at the busy community center below. "When we orchestrated that warehouse incident, we hoped to find someone who understood compassion. Instead, we found someone who could teach it." The numbers backed up his words. Family participation had increased by 200%, program completion rates had doubled, and most importantly, the feedback spoke of real connection, real understanding, real hope. Nate's phone buzzed with a text from Bella, now attending the Foundation's after-school program. "Dad!" Sarah's dad smiled today, a real one. Sarah was the Marine's daughter, and the message confirmed what Nate had sensed during the orientation. Another family finding their way forward. Looking at his calendar for the rest of the day, full of family meetings, program developments, and community connections, Nate felt the same certainty he'd experienced that rainy day in the warehouse. Sometimes the biggest acts of service start with the smallest choices to see people as people, to value humanity over protocol, to choose connection over convenience. Outside his window, autumn leaves danced in the breeze, and families continued arriving, each carrying their own stories, their own hopes, their own potential for transformation. The Foundation had changed, but so had he, growing into a role that felt less like a job and more like a calling. 1 year to the day after the warehouse incident, Nate stood at a podium in the Foundation's main conference hall. Behind him, a banner proclaimed Veterans Alliance Foundation Family Integration Program, National Launch. The room was filled with military personnel, community leaders, and most importantly, families whose lives had been touched by the program. General Hawthorne sat in the front row, his cane now more of a symbol than a necessity. Beside him, Major Reeves and Colonel Harrison watched with quiet pride as their carefully orchestrated plan from a year ago bore fruit beyond their expectations. But it was the presence of another figure that made this moment particularly poignant. Ray Tucker, Nate's former warehouse supervisor, sat nervously in the middle of the audience. "A year ago," Nate began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, "I lost a job because of a choice made in the rain. Today, I want to tell you about what I found instead." His eyes met Bella's in the front row, where she sat with Mrs. Chen, both beaming with pride. The presentation screen behind him showed photographs of the program's evolution, families finding homes, children making friends, veterans rediscovering purpose. Each image told a story of transformation, of bridges built between military precision and human connection. "We discovered something powerful this year," Nate continued, "that when you treat people as people first, everything else falls into place. Our program completion rates have increased by 300%. Our family retention rates have doubled, but the numbers don't tell the real story." He gestured to the families in attendance. "The real story is in the smiles that were hard-won, in the children who no longer fear change because they understand their own strength, in the parents who found not just support, but understanding." The screen changed to show their newest initiative, a national network of family integration centers, each built on the model they'd developed. The Foundation had taken their success in Milwaukee and created a template that could be replicated across the country. "And none of this would have happened," Nate said, his voice softening, "without a moment of choice in a warehouse." He looked directly at Tucker. "Sometimes what seems like a failure of protocol is actually a triumph of humanity." Tucker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but there was recognition in his eyes. The Foundation had recently partnered with his warehouse company, creating employment opportunities for veterans and their families. What had seemed like a career-ending incident had become a catalyst for positive change. After the presentation, as families mingled and shared stories, Bella tugged at Nate's sleeve. "Daddy, look!" She pointed to a group of children playing in the corner, children who a year ago might have been sitting silent and afraid in strange new cities. Now they were teaching each other military hand signals mixed with playground games, creating their own unique culture of understanding. Mrs. Chen, now the national coordinator for the Foundation's Community Elder Integration Program, was surrounded by other community volunteers eager to learn from her experience. Her dumplings had become famous among the families, a symbol of the comfort and connection they found in the program. General Hawthorne made his way to Nate, leaning less heavily on his cane than he had a year ago. "You know, Riley," he said thoughtfully, "when we planned that warehouse test, we were looking for someone who could understand our veterans. Instead, we found someone who could help them understand themselves again." The Foundation's approach had indeed revolutionized veteran family support. Their model of integrating practical assistance with emotional understanding had attracted attention from military support organizations worldwide. But for Nate, the real success was in the small moments: a veteran father playing with his children without scanning for threats, a military spouse finding friendship in a new city, a child learning that change could bring good things. As the event wound down, Nate found himself back in his office, looking out at the autumn sunset. On his desk sat a framed photograph, not of awards or recognition, but of that rainy day in the warehouse, captured by security cameras. It served as a reminder that the biggest changes often come from the smallest choices. His phone buzzed with a message from Major Reeves. Next phase of national rollout approved, 10 new centers by year's end. Below it was a photo from Bella, a drawing she and other program kids had made, showing stick figures in military uniforms and civilian clothes holding hands under a rainbow. Looking out over the Foundation's grounds, where families lingered in the evening light, Nate thought about the power of choices. 1 year ago, he'd chosen compassion over protocol, humanity over rules. That choice had rippled outward, touching lives he'd never imagined reaching. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families needing support, new opportunities to bridge the gap between military service and civilian life. But for now, watching the sun set on this milestone day, Nate knew that sometimes the greatest acts of service start with the smallest moments of kindness, even in the rain, especially in the rain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.